What is up, most distinguished patrons of this channel? Today we are going to dive into the topic of, is TIG really stronger than MIG and stick? And you might be surprised at the results of this video, so let's get into it. So I've done a bunch of how to TIG weld videos in the series, and I thought now is a great time to dive into the strengths and weaknesses of TIG welding, more so than what I covered in the first video or two where I talked about some of the weaknesses of it and some of the strengths. But there's a lot of people out there that have this notion that TIG is the ultimate, best, strongest, and there's reasons behind that, but there's also reasons that's not true. And we're going to dive into that in this video. And there is going to be a ton of information in here. So it's in your best interest to watch the whole video so you really grasp what is going on here. Now, when it comes to TIG welding, which is my personal favorite process, that has a lot of huge pluses, which the main one being is that there's no spatter, there's extremely clean welds, penetration and root fusion is basically guaranteed as long as you watch your puddle and watch the arc and you're paying attention to what's going on. If you do something like low amp, lay wire on a fillet, you're going to lose fusion anyways with that. So don't get me wrong, TIG is great, but you can still have weld defects and discontinuities with it that you would have with other processes as well. So it's heavily operator orientated for the skill of the person doing it as to whether or not you can make strong welds. So the first thing we're going to dive into has to do with the strength of the filler rods that you use with TIG versus the other processes. So let's do some book learning on that. So what I have in front of us is American Welding Society, more or less their part number for specific fillers. And most of these, as a matter of fact, all these are probably pretty familiar to you. And if not, well, you're going to learn a little bit about them. So what we have here is number one, ER70. That's a very common number, or part number, I guess you could call it, with MIG and TIG. With TIG, we use straightened pieces of ER70 wire. The MIG process uses ER70 that's on a coil, so it's not straightened like this. But MIG and TIG, commonly for mild steel, use the same filler. What you need to understand with this is we're mainly looking at the strengths perspective. So what we have here is the 70, that is referring to 70,000 psi tensile strength. Okay, with stick welding like the 7018 and the 6013, the first two numbers are referring to the tensile strength testing. And that's basically, if you take a sample and you pull it apart, how many thousand psi, so pounds per square inch, does it take to break the sample, to pull it apart fully, the failure point. Okay, so 7018 is 70,000, 6013 is 60,000, E71T-11, that's self-shielded flux core, that is also approximately 70,000. I know their tensile strength numbers are a little bit weird with that, but whatever. So what you need to understand is these numbers reflect what the American Welding Society says is a minimum. So if you were to set a bar of high and low, this is the absolute minimum that these fillers must test in destructive testing. Okay, this is not a reflection of what the actual testing is. All of these, and I'll put links in the description to some of the actual test results of these products, are all going to be significantly higher than the minimum in actual testing. So ER70 typically is 77,000 or more in actual testing. 7018 is between 78,000 and 81,000 from what I've seen on spec sheets. E71T generally is somewhere in the high 70s as well, sometimes as high as the low 80s. 6013, believe it or not, is typically in testing about 70,000. So it's actually higher than what its numbers would suggest. So again, all of these are the minimum. Now the interesting thing is that depending on what shielding gas you use with MIG, so with your ER70 wire, will affect the tensile strength. Okay, so if you use 100% CO2, you will actually lower the tensile strength over C25. Now, the reason I bring this up, even though this is a TIG welding video, is that you need to understand that things that you do personally can affect the actual testing results of these products. So it's not just like, oh, all of them are 70,000, you're guaranteed. No. If you use different shielding gas than what the wire was tested with, it may be below minimum spec. It's unlikely, but it's possible. Okay. The other thing that you can do is if you weld on super hot, mild steel, you will affect the strength of that weld. If you weld on super cold steel, you will affect the strength of that weld deposit. So there's a lot of things that you can personally do to affect the actual numbers. The reason these numbers exist in the fillers is to give you a rough idea of minimum, and it's to set a standard. So if you're working with a particular metal, you can look up a particular filler to know that it's compatible and ideal for that situation, rather than having a, anything goes where you don't even know what you're getting, like coat hangers, for example. The reason I bring this up is because this directly relates to a strength of TIG welding that you might not understand or realize. So all of those numbers are based on a test specimen that is defect and discontinuity free. Okay, if you yourself are incapable of making a defect or discontinuity-free weld, then guess what? These are basically fictitious numbers, because what's going to be stronger in practice? A fillet weld that has a very poor MIG weld, or with ER70, or an extremely clean 6013 weld with no defects on it? Well, odds are, even though this is a weaker filler, it will likely perform better in the sense that all those defects come together to cause weld failure, where it isn't a limiting factor of the filler strength, it's the limiting factor of the defects of the weld. Okay, and that is where TIG welding comes into kind of its own category. It isn't necessarily stronger from a filler rod perspective, so the alloy that you're creating isn't stronger. However, it is probably the easiest process to make completely defect-free, full fusion, decent penetration welds out of all of the processes. And that's because your TIG torch, and when you're welding, you're basically creating fusion separate from filler metal addition, so you can control how much penetration and how much root fusion you have on a joint, and common defects that you would find with your MIG process and your stick process are basically eliminated. And the welds start to finish with a skilled operator will be basically defect free. And that is something that is very difficult to achieve with any of the other processes, for reasons that I'll explain further down in this video, because we're going to do actual testing where I demonstrate what I'm talking about. So when it comes to TIG welding, we have some good and some bad, and let's talk a little bit about that. So for good, the number one thing, and nobody really explained this to me, but it holds to be true, and I believe this is the number one thing that TIG provides, is the most consistent welds. Now, this highly comes down to the operator's skill. So if you're unskilled, no, you're not going to make more consistent welds with the process than anything else. But when you're skilled, the welds start to finish will have the most consistent fusion, the most consistent penetration, the most consistent weld size. All of those things, start to finish, will be far more consistent with TIG than any other process. And I will prove that to you when we do some testing in a minute here. So beyond that, perfect fusion is very common with TIG. And what I mean by that is, if you have a joint like this, a fillet weld, you are going to fuse the root of that 100% start to finish without any issue. And that is something that is near impossible. As a matter of fact, it is impossible to achieve with any other process. And I'll explain what I mean by that later when we do some testing, but you have the best root fusion. You also have no spatter, so you don't have to worry about putting anti-spatter spray on something you're welding, which is really handy. So on, say, something where visual appearance matters, the cleanliness of the welds is huge, because the prep time to go between welding and painting is often zero. So you don't have to grind down welds typically, you don't have to dress them up, you don't have to knock spatter off. So that can save time. So what it takes in the actual welding process, because TIG is slower than a lot of the other ones, you gain back in the prep time. So that may be a huge benefit. Now, mechanically perfect, what I mean by that is depending on how the stress is applied to the weld, TIG welds typically are more or less concave, and having this profile can be extremely beneficial under tension because it doesn't give a hard spot for a crack or a tear to form. So when you look at your typical stick and your MIG welds, those tend to be more convex, and under stress it gives a great place for a crack or a tear to form. With TIG, it spreads the load more evenly, which can be a huge benefit. Again, this is all dependent on what stress the weld sees as to whether or not this is actually going to increase the strength. But this is a prime example of something that goes beyond tensile strength, because that's just the weld material. How you put that weld material down has almost more to do with the strength of something you're welding than the actual filler metal tensile strength, if you understand what I'm saying. Now, another great benefit is the ability to make short welds. And what I mean by that, we're going to take a piece of 1/2-inch steel here, and we're going to set up a fillet weld, and we're going to weld this short weld. Now, if you were to MIG weld this or stick weld it, what you're going to run into is about 1/4 inch into the weld, you're going to have a lack of fusion, and it exists because of that relatively cold steel, and you're just starting welding, and there's very little you can do about that. How you get rid of that is with stick and MIG, you have runoff tabs where you start welding here and then weld onto this from the runoff tab, and then that defect, that lack of fusion that exists, is cut off of what you welded. Well, how is that really practical for small parts like something like this that's 2 inches, or even worse, if you had a small part that only had like a 1/2-inch weld, if you stick or MIG weld that, you're going to have a lack of fusion in there. So it's not going to be as strong as it could be. And that's something that is very, very difficult to get around on small parts. So the ability of TIG to make perfect full fusion welds on very small components or very thick materials is a huge benefit. And that is why on a lot of widgets, like things that NASA makes and little small parts, TIG welding is often preferred, not just because of how clean the welds are, but because you can achieve things that no other process can, because again, your fusion and your filler material are two separate entities. With stick and with MIG, you're using your filler to pass an arc. Therefore, you have to consume some of the filler in order to have an arc. And the downside to that, like I said earlier, is that your fusion is basically coincides with adding filler, and you will have lack of fusions at the start of welds with all other common welding processes. TIG, you don't have that issue. Another huge benefit is unlimited thickness. And what I mean by that is this is 1/2-inch steel right here. To TIG, this is a joke. This could be 2-inch thick steel, and you could run a root pass on this with 100% fusion with absolute disregard for any kind of discontinuities in that root pass on a fillet weld. And that is again because fusion is separate from filler. So you can achieve fusion on here with even no filler. So the unlimited thickness, you as a home hobbyist, or even if you're a professional, if you had a 160 amp TIG machine, you literally could weld 3-inch thick steel and make something with it and have no concerns over the quality of the weld. That is something that does not exist with any other welding processes. And what I mean by that is, well, the short circuit MIG process is incapable of welding anything thicker than 3/8 plate, and realistically anything over 5/16 it's not really qualified for. So what I'm telling you is, with your typical home hobby machine, your MIG machine 200 amps, you're only going to be able to weld about 5/16 with proper root fusion. Anything thicker than that, you're not going to have it. So that's a huge limiting factor, because now you need to get to a $2,000 plus 250 amp wire machine and spray arc to be welding thick steel. With TIG and a 160 amp machine, you can do that. Okay, so that is awesome. Now with stick welding, stick is capable with 332 and 1/8 inch rods of welding 1/2 inch thick steel. It is. However, it will still have lack of fusion at the start of the weld that you will not have with TIG. So again, on small parts, like little, say on this super thick material, little weld here, you're not going to achieve proper fusion on that because of the nature of the process. Okay, unless you started off of it, got the weld pool hot and welded onto it. So you had a starting tab, okay? And again, I'll actually give you demonstrations of this so you understand and we're all on the same page. So let's talk about the bad or the drawbacks of TIG. So the number one thing I would say is speed. It is exceptionally slow. If you want to weld out this 1/2 inch plate fillet weld with TIG, you're going to have to do probably at least, I would take a guess, 5 passes, because it's, well, 1/2 inch. And you're going to have to take a lot of time to do that, okay? And I would say probably 3 to 4 times as much as stick, and at least that for like spray arc. I mean, spray arc with a powerful enough machine might be able to do this single pass, 3 passes at the most. So your wire processes and stick can knock this out so much faster. And in a world where time is money, sitting there for, 40 minutes to do one weld on this doesn't make economical sense. And going along, kind of coinciding with slow, it has very high heat input. And what I mean by that is, yes, TIG operates at lower amperage typically than your stick or your MIG does for this, say, 1/2 inch plate. However, that heat input is concentrated to such a small area that that area has a tremendously high heat input coupled with a very slow travel speed. And you have basically stupidly high heat input for what it is. A stick rod at 90 amps will have far less heat input to do 3 passes on this than TIG, because it's so much faster. Now, this becomes a concern on certain materials, okay? Like a good example would be cast iron. If you preheat cast iron and then weld it with a nickel rod with stick, odds are you're going to be all right and you're not going to experience too much cracking, okay? As long as you get it hot enough to start and not expedite the cooling, you give it time to cool, right? Well, with TIG, you can TIG weld cast iron. I do it all the time. However, you're going to find that you probably need a hotter preheat with it, and you need to be very careful where you slowly ramp into the heat and your travel speed is slow. You're not trying to deposit a huge amount of material fast, and then you want to slowly ramp off the heat, and you don't want to shock the material because it's going to crack. So due to the super concentrated high heat in a very small area, for certain alloys, it becomes a detriment and more difficult to work with than, say, stick. So that is a drawback. Now, when it comes to cost, TIG welding is expensive. If you're going to charge someone for welding and you're going to do TIG welding, you have to charge more than the other processes, primarily because of the speed. However, TIG welding in general is fairly expensive. And what I mean by that is the machine itself, you can get a cheap MIG or flux core machine and weld to your heart's content for probably half of what a decent TIG machine costs. So the machine is more expensive. Depending on what you're doing, the shielding gas can be more expensive because you're going through more of it. Case in point, with this big number 12 cup on there, if you're welding stainless, it's going to be far more expensive than stick or MIG, to be realistic, per inch of weld, just because of the speed and because of all of the gas you're consuming. Okay, not to mention TIG torches are expensive, gas cups are expensive. The consumables, I find that you pay a lot more for TIG wire than you do for MIG wire because it's straight and wire and they can screw you like that. But it's not cheap to charge. Like, it costs a lot to do the process, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, the other thing is skill required. And this is probably going to sound a little bit backwards when I say this, TIG is actually, in my opinion, the easiest welding process to borderline master. And what I mean by that, to get good with TIG on common materials like steel and stainless and aluminum and all of that, and to be able to functionally weld vertical up, overhead, flat position, round stuff, the time investment it takes is actually less, in my opinion, than a lot of the other processes. A great example would be stick. Get good at welding stick in all positions on stainless and steel. Okay, that's going to take far more time than it takes to get functionally good with TIG, because if you can weld flat, TIG uphill and TIG overhead welds 100% the same. There's not really any difference. So the learning curve is very steep with TIG at first, but then it kind of plateaus. And once you get a little bit of skill in it, the rest of it kind of comes together, okay? Versus all the other processes like MIG's another one. You do vertical up with MIG. Everyone can weld flat and horizontal with MIG, but do vertical up or overhead, and all of a sudden nobody can do that. And by nobody, I mean if you're lower skilled, but it's a completely different technique. And to make matters even worse, with MIG, you have to have a different shielding gas for every process that you use. So stainless for spool gun. So even though, to tie it back into here, it's expensive up front, what you save in your ability to weld with all materials with one bottle of argon, it's actually cheaper in the long run, but it does take a bigger investment in your time to get good at it initially. So you're not going to be making really clean quality welds at first with TIG, and it's far easier with stick and way, way, way easier in the flat position with MIG to do decent welds. So if you're willing to spend the time investment to get good at it, it's easier in the long run, but very difficult up front. So it does require a high level of skill. That's not good if we're going to talk about bad. Now, another thing that's bad, and this kind of ties into the speed, weld size. People have this notion that TIG welding can put down big welds. Even at 200 amps with 332 filler, unless you're weaving, you're not putting down big welds. And even weaves, you put down a wide weld, but it's not very thick in throat depth. Okay, TIG is a very low metal deposition process, so it just doesn't make sense to use it for a lot of things. You know, that's why, like on certain pipe code, you'll TIG the root, maybe TIG a hot pass and fill it out with 7018, because it just doesn't make sense to spend 5 times as long to TIG it unless there's other circumstances that require it. And the same thing for you at home. If you TIGged a root pass and then went over it with stick to fill it, that's perfectly fine and exceptionally strong. Okay, it just doesn't make sense because of the size of the welds that it puts down to spend all day TIG welding a lot of things that you might find yourself welding. Okay, the last thing I'll mention, and this is a huge drawback to TIG, you need clean material. This rust and mill scale on this crap right here is a no-go. You're going to start welding on it, you're going to get porosity, your tungsten's going to get contaminated, and it's going to weld poorly. Stick has no issue blowing through this, and let's be honest, the real world dictates that you might not have to prep everything that you want to, okay? Like if you're welding big, 4-6 inch pipes on a fence post out in the middle of Texas, why on earth would you be TIG welding? Okay, that, and second off, you can do that with stick with minimal prep all day. So again, the time savings with not having clean material with the other welding processes like flux core and stick saves a lot. And TIG, honestly, you have to get it very, very, very clean for it to work properly, and that is a huge detriment on a lot of material. Especially like you look at your auto bodies, I can't imagine getting modern auto body clean enough to TIG weld, because even crap on the backside of what you're welding can get pulled through, cause porosity. MIG is far better at that. So the gist of what's going on here is TIG is really good at making small parts, welding on small items that are very thick steel, having absolutely perfect, the most consistent fusion, and it can make arguably the strongest welds out of all of the process because they're defect-free and they don't have lack of fusion and all those issues that can come with the other processes, okay? but the drawbacks for you may be a concern. So now, with all of that said, and we're all on the same page, let's do some actual testing so I can demonstrate what I talked about here. So here's our very simple test setup, and this is half inch, and the base plate is half-inch thick steel, which this is pretty thick steel, and this will definitely break out differences between these two processes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to TIG weld this. Probably 3 passes would be my guess to get an appropriate size weld. And then we're going to come over here and weld this with probably 3 passes with 7018. I'll do a 332 rod root and then 2 1/8-inch rod passes on the top. And we're going to break them towards the face and look at the root fusion and the penetration and compare and contrast. Had a little bit of a change in plans. I ended up just doing a 3-pass weld with 332 or 2.4 millimeter rods, 7018, just 3 passes, knocked it out, and it went pretty good. For the TIG end of things, it took about, I don't know, 7 passes or so. I'll put up the actual number of passes to kind of get where I wanted to be. And honestly, it's still a little bit less material than this. And this is a great example. 7 passes with TIG versus 3 with stick. Clearly very much faster than TIG and even more metal there than here. So what I'm going to do now is break both of these to the face, and we're going to look at the root fusion of it and talk a little bit about the differences. I was going to do more weld, but I realized that it would just be harder for me to break, and we're not really looking at the strength of these two comparison. We're going to be looking at the fusion. All right, let's break this sucker. I'm glad I didn't do any more passes on this like I had planned, because I tried to break this, and well, it's just lifting up this 300 and some pound piece of steel like it's nothing. So I'm going to go do something stupid and stand on this table and just pry up to break these. All right, here goes nothing. Broke that guy. Now on to the TIG weld. That's actually quite a bit stronger. Not that we're counting on that. Well, of course I broke the tack welds. All right, I'll finish breaking that and we'll look at them. So let's do some inspecting on this and learn what's going on. So this is the TIG weld, this is a stick weld. I welded the stick from left to right, and because we're looking at the back side of it, of this plate, the start was basically on the left here. The TIG, the start is on your right. So these two are the starts. Let's look at the stick weld. Much as I suspected, if you see this right here where it pulled out of the bottom plate, this is due to a lack of fusion. Anytime you stick weld, that first at about the 3/16 to about 3/8, so somewhere, I don't know, maybe 2.5, 3 mil to about 5 millimeter, that area is going to have a lack of fusion. And that is because you start on a corner, there's nowhere for the heat escape. That typically will fuse decently, especially with hot start like the machine has that I welded. And then when you get moving, that molten pool cools down a little bit, and you're trying to weld through a less hot molten pool, and then you end up with this lack of fusion here. And that's why, like the rest of the weld, all looks very good, but we have a lack of fusion here. So how you eliminate this in the real world is you would use a starting tab. You would start on that, weld onto what you're welding, and then you would cut that off where this defect is not on what you actually welded. The problem with that is that's not very practical for a lot of parts. Say you had a part that only needed a 1/2 inch weld and you had to stick weld it or MIG weld it, because by the way, these defects happen with MIG as well. This defect now exists on your 1/2 inch welded part. That's a problem because that's a significant loss in strength by not having proper fusion in there. And again, as you can see, this whole section here all looks mint and it's good. There's no real issues there. This lack of fusion plagues MIG, it plagues stick. It's just due to the nature of the process. There's not much you can do about it beyond a certain point other than having them off of what you're welding. So when I actually broke both of these, this broke at, I wouldn't say a significantly less amount of force, but this TIG weld definitely made me strain a bit more. It took more force to break. Beyond this lack of fusion here, we can see, if you see this line here, the thickness of the plate, there's like slag under here, and I'll clean this off a little bit if I can. Yep, see? And it looks like it broke that down, but it really didn't. All that happened was the slag got underneath the plates, and it really didn't break down that original edge too good. I mean, it did some, but again, not the best. But 7018 isn't really known as a high penetration rod. Therefore, that's to be expected. So this is what you're going to see on a typical short 2-inch weld with 7018. This is very typical. Now, when you look at the TIG weld, things are a lot different. Now, keep in mind, I started here and moved over to here. There is no evidence of a lack of fusion other than at the very, very start, it is not penetrated in as much. It's still past the edge of the upright plate, but you can see how it curves down as the molten pool got hot and everything's good. But we do not see any evidence of this on this TIG weld, nor would you typically ever see that. And that is because TIG can achieve fusion on even short welds completely in disregard to the thickness of the material. So TIG gives you the ability to make very short welds on very thick materials and have the strongest welds, not because of the filler, but because of how the process works. You can achieve fusion separate from addition of filler. Now, to make this even better than what it was, I should have had a little bit longer of a dwell time at the start, and that would have cleaned this up. But for the most part, this is all looking really good. Now, the other interesting thing to note here is that when you look at how clean this section is, it doesn't look that much different than this. But again, start to finish on this weld, it is far more consistent than this, and it more or less tore at a 45-degree angle, which is ideal straight through the weld, and you're never really going to see something like this on a bend test where we break it on stick or MIG unless all of these defects or discontinuities happen off of what you're welding, which again, the practicality of that is pretty limited on a lot of things you might be TIG welding, especially small parts. Now, the TIG weld, without a doubt, has more penetration. It broke down that edge completely and fused in there. In comparison, like I said, this line here is not a line of fusion. It's just where the flux more or less was sitting. So there is far less root penetration on this than with the TIG weld. And keep in mind, now this TIG weld I welded at about 190 amps, which is higher than I would have generally done. I just did it because these plates were somewhat cold. This would be capable of being welded at about 165 amps with no problem on this 1/2 inch thick steel. I ran the 7018 2.4 millimeter 332nd rod at about 95 or 92 amps. So the cool thing is yes, it would, depending on welder, you could weld this 1/2 inch plate pretty successfully with a fairly low powered, 120, 130 amp stick welder, which is good. But the TIG welder, I mean, 160 amp TIG welder, you can get for like, I don't know, $400 or $500, and you could tackle this. Now with MIG, there is no such thing as a $400 welder that can successfully weld plates like this. You're going to have a massive lack of fusion and very weak welds with 140 to 180 amp machine. Realistically, your only hope with MIG would be a 200 amp machine with 100% CO2, and even then, you're still probably not in the realm of getting good penetration with this, and I believe that it would be weaker than both of these. So that's kind of a limitation of the wire processes, and again, you're still going to have a lack of fusion like this even with spray. Now beyond that, the heat input, undoubtedly, as far as BTUs put into this material, the TIG has to be higher because it took so many passes just to come close to equaling weld sizes. 3 passes of this, it's in the time frame, easily double, if not 3 times as long to do this TIG, 6, 7, 8 passes over this guy. So that is a huge savings. And now granted, this was stronger, there's no doubt in my mind, and it has a more consistent weld. The question is, does that really matter? Well, it really depends on what you're welding. If it's something critical that you don't want to fail, that might matter. If it's just holding something together on a trailer, I don't think that would really make that big of a difference, realistically speaking. So interestingly enough, you can see the heat affected zone colors are actually a lot wider with the TIG weld over the stick weld. And again, it comes down to, even though we deposited less metal per pass, we had to do more passes, thus put more heat into it with this over the stick. And depending on what type of material you're welding, that extra heat input may be of a concern because it could weaken the material in the heat affected zone due to the change in temperature and basically the annealing or the heat treatment that essentially comes out of this. So it's all things to be aware of, especially with critical, high strength alloys and stuff. All right, let's go to conclusion. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned a lot about the differences between TIG and MIG and why TIG in many cases can produce stronger welds. And it has nothing to do with the filler material and everything to do with just the fact that it can achieve full fusion that is consistent. And that is the big takeaway I want you guys to understand, is that TIG with a properly skilled operator can produce the most consistent, defect or discontinuity free welds of any common process you could have in your home. I mean, don't get me wrong, laser and electron beam and all those fancy things can achieve very similar things to TIG. It's just those aren't practical at this point to have in the home, especially compared to TIG welding. But it's pretty cool when you actually see tests like this that demonstrate kind of the theory of what I was talking about earlier, because I'm not the kind of person that just talks about stuff without giving you evidence so you understand. And that's the point of doing tests, is so that you can understand what's going on more so than just hearsay. So the reality of the situation is TIG, under conventional welders that you would have access to, produces the most consistent weld deposition of any common process, start to finish. And because of that consistency, it will arguably be stronger than any other process that you might be able to use in your home, simply because of that consistency. If you look at every defect, like lack of fusion, as like you start at 100% and every one of those knocks 5, 10, 15% off, well, it doesn't take too long till you're at 80% or less, and therefore you're much weaker than what it could be. And of course, there's always ways to get around those, like I talked about so many times, using a starting tab on something you're welding and then cutting it off so all the lack of fusion is on that. But let's face it, that's so impractical for a lot of things you might want to weld, that it's just not really, it's not feasible in my opinion. And that is where TIG welding comes into its own. You watch me TIG weld half-inch plate and achieve an extremely strong, almost perfect weld with perfect root fusion or near perfect, and it's easy. And doing that is impossible with MIG and stick unless you do a lot of other things in order to achieve it. So for small, super thick material parts, you really can't go wrong with TIG. It will produce stronger welds, but it's just not practical to use TIG on so many things simply because I would say to me, it's not so much the speed because, hey, none of us really do production work, right? It's not the speed, it's the inability to handle any surface contaminants. Like if I'm welding on a rusty old trailer, TIG is the last choice that I have. Flux core wire and stick are just flat out better because don't get me wrong, I almost caught myself saying that who cares about prep? I prep my material the best I can, but sometimes you just can't do it or you just don't want to. And that's where stick and flux core and even MIG to a certain extent are just better. Especially like crawling under something, how the hell are you going to TIG weld a trailer crack or something? It's just not practical. And I think you guys are on the same page with me. So for certain jobs, absolutely TIG is stronger. But for other ones, like some rusty trailer or auto body or that sort of thing, it's not what I would want to be using because it's just going to be frustrating and it's also very slow. With that said, and I'm being honest when I say this, okay, I think that if you're into welding and you want to be able to weld like any kind of material, TIG is actually your best friend. It's the first process I learned. It's my favorite process for welding. And in a home where you're not dealing in high production, what you can achieve with it, with the lack of, prep that you need after welding, like you don't need to grind down or knock off BBs, and just the cleanliness of the welds and the fact it's so relaxing to do without sparks and, it's quiet. I really think that everyone out there should at least consider TIG or having a TIG welder in their home because you'd be shocked at how beneficial it is. Like I thought, okay, I'm just going to TIG weld some stuff together and I won't use it for, very much and I'll use stick more. And then I started getting into where my buddies are like, hey, I got this copper or brass terminal for this electric motor that got broke, right? Can you fix that? Well, guess what? With the TIG welder, I was able to take that terminal eye and clean it up and weld it back together. How are you going to do that with stick or with MIG? You can't. I mean, if you have an oxyacetylene torch, you could have brazed it back together, but TIG gives you almost, it's like a mythical power on oddball stuff that you don't have with anything else, and that's because it's more or less fusion and filler. And even if you don't have filler for the particular material you need to fuse together, you can still do that with the TIG torch. So from a practical standpoint, it is an invaluable tool to have in the home because it gives you the ability to repair almost anything that's made out of metal with one cylinder of argon and your little TIG welder. No other welding process has that kind of versatility, and in the long run, the cost isn't as much as you would suspect. Yes, the upfront, investment in your time to get at least functionally good to where you can weld something, yeah, that's a little bit high. But once you are able to run decent beads on fillet welds and stuff, the rest of the stuff really isn't that hard in my opinion. Even aluminum isn't as hard as what you would think or what people say it is. You just need to know what you're doing, that's all. So anyways, I'm going to leave you with this thought. Don't be afraid of TIG welding. If you're interested in it, definitely consider it. Consider taking a community college course in it to where you can burn up all their materials for a reasonable rate to learn and work with an instructor, or buy a $400 or $500 TIG machine and go and start practicing. I guarantee you won't regret having the skill, and yes, you can produce the strongest, most defect-free welds on anything with it, which for a lot of critical work is a huge benefit because you can do things that other people can't. And truth be told, I've done a lot of side jobs in my life in the last decade or so, and almost all of them, especially the highest paying ones, were all on stainless, aluminum, and other stuff like copper that nobody else could weld. So it's almost a guaranteed money maker for you guys that want a side hustle. Like, get good at TIG, and it's going to provide you food on your plate and money in your bank account far more than MIG, far more than stick, to be honest, for side jobs. So with that said, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you got any comments, questions, thoughts, you know where to leave them. Until next time.